Well, I'm super honored to be here. I think back to 2019 when the last Hāpi Symposium was underway, and that was when I came back to the bench and started with Lance recruiting me to do yeast innovation. So, so much of my early studies and thoughts were all inspired by Sauvignon Blanc wine from New Zealand hops, and the potential for yeast to be able to transform these aromas in beer and amplify them. So it's just honestly an honor to be here to share the work we've done over the last 4 years with you. All right. So basics, I'm just going through some introduction, a lot of the fundamental kind of work we did to get to our products now that are in the market, Thiolized yeast. So I'll go through that and then a little bit of the application. So what are thiols? Yeah, obviously people here know them. It's not such an uncommon term. They're very well known for their abundance in Sauvignon Blanc wines, Nelson Sauvin Hallertau Blanc hops, and then, you know, they're all over the place. They're in a lot of tropical fruits. They are what give the signature tropical and citrus aromas. They're super potent aroma compounds, so expect, you know, your small amounts of these compounds to make a big effect in the finished beer. If you look at what a thiol is, we all know what an alcohol is. Well, the OH is just now an SH in a compound. So these can really vary and be found in a lot of chemical classes. Thiols are not just what we see in beer, but they're all over. Okay, so as a side, yes, they are in many other industries. So coffee is one industry that focuses on thiols for the roasty character. In tropical fruits, you've got for sure the signature aromas of guava, passion fruit, grapefruit, all being of thiol origin. And then in cannabis, there's, you know, MBT, we all know what that is in beer. The skunk character is one of the signature thiol aroma compounds in cannabis. Yeah, so as a quick analogy, I think this was helpful when I was starting out to realize how difficult it is to study these. They're super, super low in the parts per trillion, and at that level, they can have a profound sensory impact. So what does that mean? An Olympic pool, which doesn't seem as big as it is, but it's 21,000 barrels of water in that pool, can really just a small drop of a thiol compound in an Olympic pool would be an odorant threshold for these compounds. So comparing to other aroma compounds in beer, diacetyl, you'd need more of a shot glass, and then your esters and aldehydes would be a couple pints to maybe a couple barrels of beer. And as just a primer, how do we increase thiol levels in beer? Well, we can do this with the raw material being high in thiol, so hops that contain tons of thiols, tropical fruits that contain tons of thiols, obvious ways to introduce thiols into beer. But another pathway for introducing thiols is getting the yeast to coax them out, releasing them from precursors that are found in the malt and in hops. So the font here is a little bit small. You guys will all have the PowerPoint to go back to after the talk and the seminar. But I just wanted to kind of give a couple of the example of what we commonly talk about thiols in beer. There are many probably other thiols that we don't talk about, but the ones that we commonly talk about are the 4-MSP, 3-SH, 3-SHA, 3S4MP, and 3S4MPA. And the nomenclature is just IUPAC versus old nomenclature with mercaptan, but those are all kind of analogous ways of talking about these compounds. And yeah, the thresholds vary from 1.5 nanograms per liter or parts per trillion up to 120 parts per trillion. And when you're looking in Sauvignon Blanc wine, the ones that are really abundant are really the 3SH compound exhibiting grapefruit passion fruit aroma, and then you get some of the other 4-MSP and 3SHA that you know, give it a little bit more box tree and additional passion fruit focus. And in dry hop beer, we can get high levels of these compounds on our own, just by putting dry hops into the beer. So I put an estimate of 4 pounds per barrel and kind of a range of what you'd see with various hops that have been reported for their free thiol. And yeah, we can get to very high odorant levels of thiols just through dry hopping. Yeah, and then fundamental work on thiols has been in Nelson Sauvin. That's been the really poster child of a lot of the research. So 3S4MP was first identified in Nelson Sauvin, and that can be at very high levels in beer using that hop. So as a side, just the history of 3SH, I find this pretty interesting because it's really an interplay of the science of understanding the aroma coming from the fruit and how that was applying to wine and hops at the same time. So really the earliest kind of record of 3SH found in anything was in passion fruit. And then shortly after, Sauvignon Blanc, with the aromas coming through very passion fruit-like, was studied for this aroma. And what they found is that Sauvignon Blanc wine was very high in this 3SH compound as well. And then shortly after, wow, grapefruit has it too, and guava. And then more recently, there was evidence for these occurring in beer as well. And actually in 2008, that was the first example of literature suggesting that it could potentially be found in just a malt-based beer without the addition of any hops. So how are thiols made? There's both the, kind of the synthesis pathway in the plant and the release pathway in the plant, and then there's also the potential for yeast biotransformation. So in the plant, you have really a byproduct of fatty acid metabolism and some of these C6-aldehyde compounds that the plant is really looking to get rid of and detoxify. And how it does this is it just conjugates them to glutathione, which are it's a sulfur-containing compound. Once that glutathione conjugate to the thiol is formed, it's really just stored in the vacuole, and until another enzyme is there to release the free thiol, it's aromaless. So in a lot of hops, this is the majority of where thiols are in the precursor form. During plant ripening in fruits, hops, some other, not really much in grapes and not really much in malt, but in some plants you have the breakdown pathway occurring too, where free thiols come through and you get the aroma impact. And then yeast is able, and this is the first evidence with Sauvignon Blanc wine, is able to uptake these precursors through transporters. They are able to process them to a more simplified precursor form, which is the cis form or cysteine form, and they can express a carbon sulfur lyase and cleave the free thiol from the cysteine and result in aroma. So again, a precursor really is just the starting block. Is the glutathione 3SH. There are 2 intermediate forms, which different enzymes will clip off each end of the glutathione. And then the last precursor form is the cysteine form, which is really the most studied and accessible for the yeast enzymes to release. So carbon sulfur lyases occur all over in nature. A fun story of how we've uncovered some of these enzymes is actually interesting, and you can ask me about it later. But the precursor cysteine 3SH is just cleaved here at this carbon-sulfur bond. And once that is cleaved, the resulting compound is the free thiol and pyruvate and ammonia. In yeast, the very studied carbon sulfur lyase is the IHC7 gene. They call it a beta lyase. So there's a lot of kind of mixed terminology for what these enzymes are based on their exact mechanism of release, but we'll refer to them broadly as carbon sulfur lyases. So this is actually out of a wine paper here, again, where a lot of this research has been done here. And actually, I'm speaking to a lot of your language, but, in the US, we don't really see a lot of this research daily, and you guys probably have this under wraps pretty well by now, but IRC7 is the yeast beta lyase enzyme that can cleave free thiols from precursor. This occurs readily in wine because the nutrients are limited, and when they're limited, the IRC7 gene is active and able to release these thiols. In beer studies, there's really been not much evidence at all for its activity because the nutrients are so high. We have plenty of free amino nitrogen, so this gene is always off. So this comes to how we started out. In the beginning, we were really interested in just trying to do this naturally through yeast hybrids. And we knew there were wine strains that showed high activity or high beta-lyase activity. And we tried using these in beer fermentations just to see if we would get any thiol release. Unfortunately, most of them don't ferment maltose very well and certainly don't ferment maltotriose. So those weren't viable options for just single pitch yeast strains. And some of them are also phenolic. So taking the next approach was to make yeast hybrids where you would combine the beta-lyase activity from the wine strain and have all the good parts of the beer strain to go with it. When we did this, we were convinced we were starting to smell something, but I think we had to get really trained up on thiol sensory before we could really start making those conclusions, and really what we found in the end is that these hybrid yeasts were not able to significantly enrich for free thiol in beer because of the excess nitrogen. It's still a problem. The gene's still off. Whether it's a good gene or not, it's not expressed. So yeah, this is where we really started to see differences. We started using an approach to engineer the strains to activate and express that enzyme in beer fermentation. So no longer do we have to worry about the nitrogen level. We're activating the gene so it's not turned off during beer fermentations. And we use CRISPR-Cas9 to do this. And if anyone wants more detail on how this works, it's really, it's kind of like a surgeon who can go in and operate and stitch back up, and basically, the tools to do all the editing are out of the cell by the time they're put into a beer fermentation. And really, like a word processor, you're just changing either a single nucleotide in the genome or inserting a gene or activating a gene. So it's incredibly specific and incredibly useful when you're trying to take something from science to brewing application, because it's really really highly effective. So with our thiolized yeast, we basically took 2 carbon sulfur lyases, IRC7 and PAP-B. IRC7 is the yeast enzyme. PAP-B is actually a bacterial carbon sulfur lyase. And these enzymes work in a very similar way. They're just cleaving that carbon sulfur bond to release the free thiol. With Cosmic Punch, this is our first release strain. This is a cisgenic strain, so actually with regulatory kind of differences in different countries, this is one that tends to be more considered a natural modification and something that could occur through breeding. So this is a cisgenic modification. So I think like Australia and New Zealand would be very open to a strain like this in the coming years for kind of introducing these. But anyway, with an inactive IRC7 gene and our parent strain, which was the London L3 strain, hazy IPA strain, it doesn't even have an active IRC7, let alone does it express it in beer. So we used CRISPR-Cas9 to take the IRC7 gene from Chico, and we activated it with a constitutive promoter, and we now have Cosmic Punch. So it's really just expressing constitutively the IRC7 gene from another brewing strain. And then with Heliogazer, this is using the bacterial PAP-B gene, and it's an enzyme from S. hominis, a bacteria that resides on your skin and is commensal and kind of protects us from pathogens, part of our microbiome. And so the enzyme from PAP-B, or S. hominis, PAP-B, is highly active, much more active than IRC7. So this is why we chose to use this enzyme on another version of these thiolized yeast. So the difference here is just kind of, again, going back to the Olympic pool model, Cosmic Punch is adding drops into the pool where Heliogazer is adding shot glasses. So when you have the aromas coming through in Sauvignon Blanc wine, that's what you're going to be getting with this Heliogazer strain. Cosmic Punch is probably going to get you something that would be normal loads of a dry hop. All right, so summary of our engineered strains. We have Cosmic Punch that is using the yeast IRC7 gene, and then just Star Party, Heliogazer, and Lunar Crush. We have Chico, London Ale 3, and Mexican Lager strain that have expressed PAB B. And yeah, definitely all malt-based fermentation smells like Sauvignon Blanc wine. It is very potent. So a little bit about thiol precursors. They are found in all the raw materials, basically, that we use in beer, the barley and the hops, and then more recently, and work in partnership with Joss, using wine grapes as a way of introducing these thiol precursors. So with glutathione and malt, similar to Scott's picture where you see the ratio of free thiol and bound thiol, well, barley at the usage rate has even more bound thiol than hops do. So it's a massive, massive sink of thiol compounds that is just completely odor inactive because there's nothing there to release it in a normal beer fermentation. It seems to be more so found in barley than it is in oats and wheat, which is kind of surprising, but that's what our research has shown so far. And then with kilning rates, you start to kind of see the precursor amounts decrease over time. And there's still active research. We're actually in partnership with a malt supplier in the US looking into this a little bit more. So thiol precursor in these example is just showing, the two-row variety, a two-row malt, Munich malt and a Vienna malt, of varying kiln rates, but kind of just base malts, and showing their variation in the amount of precursor they have. Obviously, the biggest sink of precursors in the glutathione form, which is the tallest bar on all of these. And then there's a significant amount of the cis-glycine form, and then the cysteine form as well is pretty abundant relative to free thiol. So, and then as you see in wheat and oats, there's really nothing coming through. When we do a fermentation with Heliogazer, we're getting massive release of these thiol compounds in the two-row, the Vienna. Actually, you can't see the Vienna down on the bottom, but it's the second bar, and then the Munich. It's getting up to that Sauvignon Blanc level of thiols. And when you're doing sensory on these, it's interesting, but the more aroma that gets packed into your beer, the less obvious these thiol compounds become. They start to synergize and change the perception of what you would get in isolation. So even with the Munich malt, which we saw a lot of free thiols being released, we still significantly had a higher perception of tropical and passion fruit with the two-row. Free thiol and precursor and hop. Yeah, so we chatted a little bit about this already. I think there'll probably be more talk about this in the continuing talks today. But, free thiols are in the parts per trillion, parts per billion, typical of New World hop aromas. They have the highest amounts of free thiols when you're talking hops. And then thiol precursor, New Zealand hops in general are loaded up with free thiol. They're also loaded up with thiol precursor, no surprise. But there's also evidence that noble hops and C hops are very high in the bound thiols as well. And then again, it's about 100 to 1,000-fold more bound thiol than free thiol. Lots of potential for release. Scott touched on mash hopping a little bit, and what we kind of worked off of two models of this. What Scott talked about is complexing metals. That's probably a big component of this. But another component of this is actually in the mash, there are enzymes that are breaking down the precursor forms into more accessible precursor forms. So we saw a big shift of hop precursors from the glutathione pool to the cis-gly and cis form. So that was really an interesting application of mash hopping and something we found very cool from the beginning. And here you can see the middle bar is the mash hop example in each case. Cosmic Punch and Heliogazer, Heliogazer kind of goes off the charts, but they're both getting an added benefit of mash hopping. And then surprisingly, whirlpool hopping seems to be slightly diminished in the free thiol. And again, coming back to metals, it might be just a better way of complexing those metals in the mash. And then in the whirlpool, hops have metals too. So you could potentially be adding oxidative processes with whirlpool hopping that limits the amount of thiols that come through. Oh yeah, and that was actually, this experiment was done with the Motueka hops from Freestyle. That was a very fun partnership. All right, a good reference for everybody to go back to, but Laurent at Nicios has a good summary of varying levels of thiol and thiol precursor in different hops. So check this one out. And then again, going back to other raw materials, maybe non-traditional raw materials for beer, but very cool applications of getting more precursor into the wort for the yeast release and fermentation. So in partnership with Joss, actually, timing was pretty serendipitous for the release of our yeast, and also Joss's intro to the market with Phantasm. And we really grasped onto this quick because we thought, wow, this is just another way of fortifying and kind of building up the precursor pool in wort. And as you can see, those wine grape precursors are definitely converted over by the yeast, and it adds a nice additional tropical profile. Yeah, and then a little bit of the science beyond what we typically talk about, since I feel like this audience is pretty mature. The wine literature here had kind of teased out a bunch of the upstream components of the pathway. How do the yeast take up the precursor? How do they break the precursor down? What kind of other bottlenecks might be upstream to the beta-lyse enzyme, which frees that precursor or that thiol from the precursor? So we did look into this with our Pat B strain, where you're highly overexpressing an active carbon sulfur lyase. And even when you kind of chop off all of these upstream pathways for getting thiol precursor into the cell or processing the precursor down to the cysteine form, we're still seeing a lot of release of free thiol in that context. So yeast are pretty savvy. They figure it out. They might have certain genes that are pretty important in importing or processing down the precursor, but there's a lot of redundancy. So, our brewing strains are pretty good at, taking in those precursors and releasing them. And it can be all the way from the glutathione precursor. All right, so a little applying the science. And I know a lot of you guys haven't had access to these strains. Take this in any new yeast development that you're kind of looking at in the brewery. A lot of this can be used just assessing any yeast. Our biggest considerations are how thiols interact with other compounds in the beer. And with hops, you're introducing such high intensity of aroma that those thiols really have to still be in high intensity to match hop intensity. So, there's some masking between hops and free thiols. And then there's also some potential additive benefits and synergy. And I'll go through 2 research findings with Nelson that kind of show this relationship between thiols and hops. And then, you have a consideration of the aroma quality relating to concentration. At what point are you just not knowing whether there's any more free thiol? Like, I guess with a Sauvignon Blanc wine, are you really going to notice a difference when it's 10,000 parts per trillion or 20,000 parts per trillion? The major dominant aroma there is still a passion fruit aroma. So really understanding a little bit more about how much is necessary. And then also, is there a point to where they don't really do any better for the beer? Does it become unpleasant? Are there any off notes when you get to really high concentrations? And this really comes down to the individual, their thresholds and their preference. And we found that a lot. These can be polarizing. People can love them, people can hate them. So in your first kind of test at the brewery, I would suggest this experiment number 1. You're just doing really a lager with and without a thiolized yeast. So taking, a blank slate lager, malt-based, and seeing what the actual sensory descriptors are for thiols. So you're really honed in on what these yeast are releasing. sensory exercises like a hedonic or a kata, just descriptive, would give you a lot of data so that you can see who on your team can recognize these compounds and what attributes they're recognizing. Experiment 2 is kind of, you now know what the thiol aroma is. Now what happens when you dry hop on top of thiol aroma? So this is the same lager base, but now both are with the thiolized yeast and one is dry hopped. And that kind of gets into all those synergy, masking, additive relationship between the compounds and hops and the thiol compounds that are being released by the yeast. So qualitative differences with and without hops. Maybe there's a blending exercise in the end where you're doing some, half of the thiolized without a dry hop, half of it with a dry hop, so you're getting at where the threshold really comes in for you of where the thiols are obvious but not dominant. And then experiment number 3 would be really just your straight up West Coast, whatever recipe you're running on or that day, drawing off a side stream of the wort and replicating the recipe but with the thiolized yeast. And how do you see the differences between those recipes? That's really the end goal. Like, is this going to improve my West Coast IPA or my NEPA? And that one's a little bit tricky. It takes some tetrad, it takes hedonic, just descriptive analysis, but even more importantly, I think we've seen in a lot of anecdotal comments from customers is potentially this even is a way to extend your shelf life. These thiol compounds tend to stick around after some of the other compounds and hops will drop off. So another type of exercise you can run with these products. All right, and then quickly the Nelson Sauvin research. When they were studying, basically the interactions between thiol compounds and esters, they found that the combination can drive a higher intensity of tropical aroma. So this bottom corner, right here is showing that the fruity intensity is increasing with the combination of 2-MIB and 4-SMP, the two kind of pretty common aromas in Nelson Sauvin. And then another one was looking at the synergy of thiols and terpenes in Nelson Sauvin. And with 4-MSP thiol, you were getting mixing with LGC, which is just linalool, geraniol, and beta-citronellol. The combination, again, was driving more tropical aroma in that context. So it's complex sensory, but very interesting. And to observe this in your beer is going to be the most important decision. Does this really enhance more of the tropical aroma or not? All right, and then the last slide here is something we hand out with all of the yeast as we ship it out, but it just gives a bunch of tips into making more thiol dominant beer or thiol complementary beer, because truly it's going to be up to you. This is a tool to design, kind of more tropical aroma in your product, but it can be taken many ways. Changing malt, changing a blending ratio of thiolized yeast and non-thiolized yeast, mash hopping, using phantasm. All of these are like levers to pull with these yeast and definitely can make an impact in recipe design. All right, and again, happy to talk thiols all day with anybody, but if you need to, you can always contact me through email. I'm pretty responsive to email too.
You mentioned a couple of different sources of thiols throughout your talk. The actual fruit, where they were discovered in, hops, barley, etc. But then the list of thiols that have a flavor threshold was only 5 or 6 long or so. So are there other thiols around that we are simply not aware of, or that are just not above the flavor thresholds that's relevant?
Oh, I'm sure they're above the flavor threshold. They just haven't been as studied. And honestly, a lot of the methods and analytical tools to measure thiols haven't been developed for the unknowns. So if we haven't detected them at the parts per trillion level, and we don't know what they are, we really can't quantify them. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more thiols that are in there that are aroma impactful and probably, need to be studied. There's another one, 3-sulfanyl octanol, that was identified in Nelson Sauvin and really gets very little mention, but I'm sure that one is pretty pleasant. It's supposed to have a nice peachy aroma. We hope so, yeah. And honestly, there's unpleasant thiols too, like dank, diesel, onion. Like if depending on the levels, you don't want a lot of that around. So, you know, knowing a little bit more about all of the thiols, good and bad, is going to be really important.
Do you guys have any plans on developing maybe like non-GM, like thiolized yeast, like something like Tropicalia 77, or if you're aware of that, or you can speak on maybe the differences?
So the Tropicalia strain, I think, it's interesting because it's probably not an active beta-lyase enzyme, but it might have other influences on thiol compounds, like what they measured, and I haven't used the strain, but what they measured in that experiment was 3-SHA. So maybe there is some benefit to that strain in pushing some of the free 3-SH into 3-SHA, which has a lower threshold and is more passion fruit driven. But we really, honestly, we haven't had luck with non-modified strains. And, you know, Peter and I have talked a bit. There's probably some ways to coax it out through breeding. It's just not going to come to the level where when you're in a dry hop beer, you're wanting, you know, to match the hop intensity. But it certainly will be an option, yeah.
Would you guys be looking, I mean, I'm not sure how much you guys are working with like other legislation and stuff. I mean, is that something that we're going to be able to see in New Zealand, you guys' yeast?
We're very hopeful. I know with Australia, it's opening up for cisgenic modifications, and that's a similar path that we took in Canada. When they're cisgenic, like the Cosmic Punch, it comes within the existing gene pool of yeast, so you're not introducing any foreign DNA, and that's much more widely accepted because it can technically occur through a breeding approach. You know, we took a promoter and activated it, but yeast could recombine that. If we were very, very patient and screened a ton of them, that might eventually occur in nature. So yeah, like Canada, we went through a novelty determination, and they consider Cosmic Punch non-novel. And I think similarly with Australia, some of those, that's a potential for us to enter the market as well. And I don't know how open New Zealand would be to adopting the Australian regulation, but I think it is within the coming years that this will be more of an option. And we're definitely going to apply once it is an option for us too. We're limited by a hefty application fee of like $80,000. So if anyone wants to fund it, okay.
Any research being done avoiding unwanted thiols as you're unlocking all of this? Obviously, there are things that we don't want in the beer that you can unlock. Yeah, can you speak on that?
Yeah. So when we turn this PAP-B gene up even more, we do start to see some off-pleasant notes come through. And it could be a threshold effect of 3-SH because it smells terrible if it's a pure compound. It's awful. But I think it's probably another aspect of, you know, these unknown thiols that are being freed up, similar to how they free up in ripening during hop harvest. They're being freed up by the yeast, and, you know, thresholds become a big factor there. Like, how much is being released? Can we detect it? Is it unpleasant? Is it pleasant? Because we get some dank character from our Heliogazer strain that tends to be more pleasant and helps to build complexity if it's in the right combination of hops. And then the malt precursor has truly really been isolated to the passion fruit aroma of 3-SH, but it becomes complicated when there's so many unknown thiol and thiol precursors and hops. Yeah. I'd like to know more. It's definitely a very big possibility of just understanding more about the hop chemistry and how these compounds come in. Maybe a tool. Our thiolized yeast can uncover these because you can blast them out.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.